Hi everybody, welcome to this week's online lecture series. Today we are going to focus on Ancient Egypt and Judaism. Specifically, we're going to look at the origin of Judaism. Now these two things do go together. We've been studying Ancient Egypt, so we want to see how the first of our big five religions fits into our story. When I say the big five, I mean Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and of course Islam. Judaism is where we are going to start, so let's go into it. You will want to take notes as you follow along here. So here we go. Setting the stage, the origin of Judaism. Canaan was the ancient home of the Hebrew people. I'm going to talk a lot about the Hebrews in this story, and in a lot of ways they're interchangeable with the word we're more familiar with, which of course is the Jews. Hebrews were later called the Jews, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. But in the old story here that I'm going to tell you, we're going to use the word Hebrews. But understand, we are talking about the same group of people as what we know as the Jews today. Hence, Judaism, Jews. You can hear the similarity there. The Hebrews' history, legends, and moral laws have had a major influence on Western culture. They've been around for a very long time. Their culture has permeated into a lot of different aspects of Western civilization, and we're going to see where a lot of that comes from here in this lecture. Now, there is some commonality with a couple other religions. So part of their history is shared with Christianity and Islam. They're not the same, but Christianity came from Judaism. Christianity, of course, is based from the teachings of Jesus Christ and his followers, and Jesus was actually born as a Jew. So there's definitely more history that will be explored later on with that. And there is some similarities with Islam, as we're going to find out. Now, we have to start regionally here. We have to look at a map. A lot of the land we're going to talk about here takes place just north of Egypt. Our story will involve Egypt today, but if you can see my cursor here, when we just go just north into the east, we get this piece of land called Palestine. Now today we would call it modern-day Israel, but it's often called Palestine or even Canaan if we go look on the map here on the right. In fact, that's what we're going to reference it as here as Canaan. But whether I say Israel or Palestine or Canaan, I'm really talking about the same piece of land that is on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, just north into the east of Egypt. So, we have to go back to the search for the promised land. Now, a lot of this information does come from the Bible, and we don't use that as a religious text. We use that actually as a historical text. It's one of the best known and best credited historical texts out there. Ancient Palestine's location made it a crossroads of the ancient world. When I say crossroads, we definitely mean a lot of people are moving through there. Well, as you saw on the map, Palestine itself is a region at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. That's really important for us to know, because geography really matters in this situation, as you're going to see a migration of the Hebrew people from Palestine down into Egypt. And we'll talk about that in a little bit here. The Hebrews settled in Canaan, which was located in Palestine. Just remember back to the map I just showed you, again, talking about the same piece of property. According to the Bible, Canaan was the land that God had promised to the Hebrew people. They've had a stake in that region for a very long time. We're talking over a few thousand years. So this is a very important piece of property for the Hebrew people. Now, a lot of what we know about this story not only comes from the Bible, but the Bible itself also is connected to something called the Torah, which you see here. The Torah is what the Hebrews and now Jews use as their sacred text. And more often than not, when you see it, it's on scrolls like this, not in a typical book form. So most of what we know of early Hebrew history is found in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible known as the Torah. Very sacred book. Most religions on the planet have some type of historical text that they use as a guide for their faith. The Torah is the most sacred writings to the Hebrews and makes up even part of the Old Testament for Christians. Now, this is a good time for me to just mention, if at any point in this video, if I'm going too fast or you need to catch up, feel free to hit the pause button and start it up again when you're ready. In the Torah, God chose a guy named Abraham to be the father of the Hebrew people. This is a very important part of the story. The whole story of Judaism starts with Abraham. Abraham himself, he was a shepherd who lived in Ur. Now, if you can remember, we talked about Ur just a couple of weeks ago when we looked at Mesopotamia. Ur was one of the first cities on the planet that existed in the first civilization called Sumer. So that should sound somewhat familiar to you. Now, in this story, God commanded Abraham to move his people to Canaan around 1800 BC. Around 1650 BC, the descendants of Abraham decided to move to Egypt. Well, the reason they would have wanted to do this is Canaan's not exactly the best place to live. That doesn't mean it's desert and dry and nobody can live there, but it's not the best place for agriculture. So the people at the time, whether you were Hebrew or anybody else, they knew the place to get the food and to survive. The breadbasket of the world was down in Egypt. Why? Because of the Nile. And so it would have been a very natural decision for them to make. If Canaan wasn't working out for them, they would have wanted to head to Egypt. Now, one of the things that's going to be pretty important to remember here is the Hebrews were not like the Egyptians. The Hebrews were monotheistic, and they worshipped God Yahweh. That's important because when you come in contact with the dominant culture at the time, which is the Egyptians were polytheistic. And there's going to be a little bit of culture clash going on there because religion matters to people. It's just a fact of life. And so when you come in and say, we only believe in one God, to a dominant culture that believes in many gods, there's going to be some friction and potential conflict going on there. Now, one of the other parts of this story of the origin of Judaism involves a covenant. A covenant's a fancy word that means promise. And in this case, it was a promise made by Abraham and his people to obey Yahweh. In return, Yahweh had promised to protect Abraham and his descendants. It became really the cornerstone of their faith and really how people adhered to Judaism. Here's an image of Abraham. He was a shepherd. He was an older man. And there's definitely more to his story. We're not going to explore it here, but for those of you familiar with your biblical history, you might know a little bit more about Abraham. Well, what happens next is not exactly a happy part of this story. When the Hebrews come down to Egypt, as I mentioned, there's friction. There's not exactly a big celebration saying, come on in, let's be friends. The Bible says the Hebrew people migrated to Egypt due to drought and famine. Like I said, Canaan was not working out for them. They needed to find more food. Egypt was the place to do that. So according to the Bible, the Hebrews migrated to Egypt due to drought and famine. At first they were accepted, but later on they're going to be the outcasts. They're going to be seen as different, and it's going to be really easy to pick on them and use them for slave labor. There's no doubt they became slaves. This is well documented in many sources, and they are going to spend many, many, many years in slavery. People are born slaves and die slaves. Their children are born slaves and died slaves. And that brings us to Moses. Because for the longest time, the Hebrew people had believed somebody was going to lead them out of bondage. Somebody was going to lead them out of slavery. And Moses' story is one of the most famous stories in all of world history for that very reason. So let's talk a little bit about him. At the time of Moses' birth, the Pharaoh felt very threatened by the Hebrews and commanded that all firstborn males be killed. The idea here was that there was supposed to be a Hebrew man-child. Yes, that's the words they used, Hebrew man-child, that was prophesized to lead the Hebrews out of slavery. Well, if you're the Pharaoh and you're reliant on slave labor, you don't want this to happen. So he says, well, we can either kill all the Hebrews. Well, that's not a good idea because that kills all our slave labor. Or if we kill all the firstborn males out there, we're sure to kill this child who's supposed to be the prophecy. So Pharaoh had his men go out and kill all the firstborn males. It's a very sad story. Well, Moses' mother knew what was going to happen if she kept him. He would be found and he would be killed. So she did what any sane mother would do. She decides to put him in a basket and lay him in the reeds of a raging river. I make fun, but that's actually what happened. So Moses' mother laid him in the reeds of the Nile to actually save his life. And it did. Moses floated down the river he's a tiny baby. And an Egyptian princess finds him and raises him in luxury. As the story goes, she had always wanted children, and her husband had died. And so she saw this as an opportunity to finally have a child. Now, she knew he was Hebrew. He had a cloth with him that showed he was Hebrew, but she didn't care. She decided to raise him anyway, and because she was an Egyptian princess, he was going to be raised as a prince of Egypt. Here's an image depicting that. Moses' mother finding him in the reeds of the Nile. Obviously, she's very excited, and his life was saved because of this. Now, he did not forget his Hebrew birth, but no one knew, including the Pharaoh. Really, only people that knew would have been Moses' mother and his new mother, his adoptive mother. There was also a servant of the adoptive mother who knew, and she's going to let his secret out a little bit later. But Moses grows up thinking he's a prince of Egypt, but the servant lets that secret out, and once everybody knows Moses is Hebrew, well, he can't be a prince anymore. So they actually kick him out, and he becomes a slave, just like the rest of the Hebrews. I mean, once the man who had everything on his shoulders is now a slave. Well, again, I'm going to keep this story somewhat simple, but Moses is visited by God, and by the command of God, he was told that he's supposed to lead the Hebrews out of Egypt. You don't just walk up to Pharaoh and say, hey, can we go? And in fact, that's what he tried. He said, let my people go. And Pharaoh wasn't really interested in letting his slaves walk right out of town. So this took some time, but it became known as the Exodus. Moses' famous line is, let my people go. It's been seen in countless movies, classic film, The Ten Commandments, DreamWorks animation, The Prince of Egypt, lots of different depictions of Moses' story and this very famous line. So, picture depicting that, asking Pharaoh to let his people go. Pharaoh was not interested. This leads into the plague story and other biblical stories.